Hello, everyone, and welcome to YouTube Masterclass. This is Coursera class. It's for adjunct professor Dr. Aaron Sheley, USC, Calarts, and Harvard. Adjunct professor to those three schools. This is also aired in other colleges, universities, and institutions. I'm here to teach a film study class. This is the fifth class of the semester, maybe even the sixth. I think it's the fifth. And it's the Orson Welles films class, filmography class, the Orson Welles filmography. And it's a really interesting class because one of the strange things about Orson Welles' filmography is that it's kind of all over the place with like different movies and different movies that he acted in, and then ones he directed that aren't available anymore or weren't even available when they came out, or like he somehow would work on a project for a long, long time and then the whole thing would get ditched. And around the time of Hearts of Age, he had several unique avant-garde films that were coming out and none of them seemed to surface, and like even Hearts of Age didn't surface till like the 80s or 90s when people were looking up avant-garde cinema and finding it like in museums in France and finding like different archives that had like these old, the purity driven, impressionism of the old avant-garde movement that has actually been going on even in the US for quite a while. And you can see how like eventually director Stan Brakhage from Colorado, he picked up the avant-garde movement and sort of made a frame-by-frame artistic celebration of movement of the avant-garde. And you can kind of see how like each of these films by Orson Welles, as the decades are going on after the 30s and the 40s, when he's doing Citizen Kane, it's like he's trying different like genres, but they're the off-color B-movie genres, sort of, but they're actually even more than that. They're like these film noir, and they drift away from the current contemporary trends of all films that are coming out during the time he's putting them out. So he gets these movies, and some of them, and that happens in today's Hollywood too, where they'll develop a movie all the way, and it like makes it completely, and it gets across, and it gets through to the screen, and it goes, and the director may not even know about it, or he might know about it, but he's busy with like three other films. And like with Orson Welles, unlike other directors, a lot of his projects didn't quite finish or were so independent that they dropped the idea or they went somewhere else with it. But the movies he did get out are really impressive. And he talks to interviewers about like, these are the films that I want to mention as my own. And some of them, and what he does talk about throughout interviews are films like Touch of Evil and Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons, and The Stranger gets talked about, The Trial, Chimes at Midnight. I'm looking at like this filmography, and The Third Man is one he acted in, but Carol Reed used the Orson Welles style. So we associate certain films with Orson Welles. We associate Mr. Arkadin even when we think about the rarer ones, or Chimes at Midnight again, like the rarer ones. And Chimes at Midnight actually kind of has this Alexander Nevsky feel, this like costume drama, this like big Shakespearean like mantelpiece to the Falstaff character, and we'll get to that. But before I talk about Touch of Evil, I wanted to talk about one of those rare films that gets in there and you don't know quite what to make of it because there's more than one version, and it's like it's been made since the silent era, sort of. And there's this one he does in 1943 called Journey into Fear. Now, I had mentioned that there was another version later during the Unvanquished Love Story or whatever, that there was another Journey into Fear around that time, or that was going to be the subtitle of that. And it doesn't make sense because the first one is actually this, like, I just looked it up on the computer. It said it was a submarine adventure, again, with the Nazi spy. And it's like, well, we saw that with The Stranger, where the Nazi spy is being chased around and he's going after him on this clock tower, and he's kind of got to race him to the top and shoot him down. And like, it reminds me of that Hitchcock film 39 Steps or Black Mill, where at the end they have to catch the guy before he runs away, and it's this big old chase down. And they do that again in Touch of Evil. Like in Touch of Evil, there's this kind of like, he has to chase down, Charlton Heston's character has to chase down the Orson Welles character, and he has to record him in sound to catch him and do all these things to like trick him into playing his sound back at a time that it wasn't appropriate to play it, to expose him to the crowd. And we did see that in Touch of Evil. But Journey into Fear is more progress in the 1940s of a movie he was making and that it actually got through, and that, like, I've seen it in piecemeal and I've seen the film. It's like he's buoyed under a submarine in some of it, and then he's like up at like kind of this resort, like there's this sun shining through in the establishing shot. That's an island shot, and sometimes you wonder if they use stock footage or if they shoot it for the film. And I think in this one you can tell that they shot some of it for the film because the backgrounds were similar throughout the times he was out on the island, and there's sort of the silhouette thing. And, by then the RKO players and everybody at the Mercury Theater had already come into Magnificent Ambersons again. And around the time of The Stranger and Journey into Fear, there was a lot of paranoia in the world about perhaps how the Nazis would come and swoop down and attack America or something, or infiltrate, like spies would infiltrate all throughout those like confessions of a Nazi spy regions, where suddenly this Nazi spy is out, or this guy spying on the Nazi is going to kill the Nazi before he gets there. And you can see these plots happening in Hollywood classical cinema all the way through Hitchcock's Notorious, where there's sort of this idea that like there's this loose Nazi and he's like going to become this big Nazi, and like the Nazi spies have to stop him from taking over the world. And I mean that plot is one of those, I was a teenage communist plot. It's like the thing that like you fear most is going to infiltrate something you love most, and then it's going to send like an actual metaphor for that, shadow of doubt. It's like into your life, and suddenly there's this killer that you respected, but you don't know he changed into this sort of like utopia-based like fascist that's becoming like large in the world of politics, and yet you don't know it because you're just in this like simple situation where you would never equate that with being like this sort of like hidden Nazi greatness of this guy that they've got to like stop all of a sudden because he's like their brother or cousin, and he doesn't need to become a Nazi that takes over the world. And I mean, you're like, okay, this is The Stranger, this is The Journey into Fear. I mean, it's like suddenly Orson Welles is like, let's play by the noir rules. The potboiler is, we find out he's a Nazi early in the movie. We didn't know that throughout his entire life. Now that we know, we've got to extinguish him before he takes over the world. And it's like that kind of plot is it's not even Red Scare. It's like pre-Red Scare. It's like Hitler Scare. It's like the big Triumph of the Will Scare. It's like, oh, well, this country is just going to devour us if we don't stop it. So what does Orson Welles do? He puts up like this social metaphor of like, I'm the character that will defeat the Nazis. And then you get to Touch of Evil and you're like, well, that's not a Nazi character necessarily, but it is. It's like still a fascist. It's still like the character that Orson Welles plays as the villain is still very mysterious, very compromised in his beliefs. And he's always saying how racist he is. I won't cover that, but there's always Orson Welles is saying what a bad person he is. And like in the movie, and he's being bad at the same time. It's like ambiguous only in the sense that he pretty much expects to be a bad person. He's like, I call myself a bad person. I am one. That's okay because I am one. I am one. He's kind of a nasty, messed up dude. This guy that's going on his he's like a police officer on the Mexican border, but in the movie Touch of Evil, but he's a corrupt one, and he doesn't really like to leave from Mexico except to go to the neutral border town. And that's where all hell breaks loose because he causes trouble for the other police officer who's Charlton Heston plays in that film, and Janet Leigh plays Charlton Heston's wife in the film. And Anthony Perkins is a hotel clerk at this really sketchy hotel. And the film is like very blackened out. Like in terms of the light to it, there's hardly any. It's film noir, but it's really taken away from the light. Like the whole thing is almost like one black, dark picture that you're just kind of moving through the dark. And, sometimes on TV, you see those TV channels that are on purpose in the dark, and you can only see like a silhouette outline across these very, very like visually black scenarios that are just consuming the whole frame. And like Touch of Evil does that on purpose, where someone will walk into the light and shadow and kind of see it. It's kind of like how they lit The Godfather later. Like they put these shots of like someone kind of moving towards it, and then the light kind of silhouettes across half the face, you know. And so in Touch of Evil, the sense is not only is it the dark side, but that the whole movie happens at night. That the whole movie happens at night. It seems like even Third Man might have a couple of day shots, but I don't remember if Touch of Evil does have a couple of day shots too, but they're very faded sunlight. And like the whole idea is almost to make it one whole night that takes place with the Touch of Evil plot. And I think Third Man's like a couple of days. And I think that in Touch of Evil, they've been making it for a while, it looks like, with Orson Welles for like a couple of years before. And they kept having to change cast, and they kept having to rewrite the script, and they kept having to edit footage out that was too violent, or there was footage that was too sexy that they had to take out. And so when they're editing out all this footage, I remember looking at this UCLA TCM archive, Library of Congress archive of Touch of Evil, and that's how they restored it for the Blu-ray or the DVD release, the home video release, and the digital video. And it's like the first shot, you know, is that 8-minute shot that tracks around during the credits, that tracks around this long tracking shot of a car where a bomb gets put in this car, and then the tracking shot takes off. And the tracking shot goes all the way through the border district town, and kind of comes around and watches people walk and talk, and you see different things going on, and finally you see this one car go by, and it's the last second of that like 7-8 minute shot, and the car explodes. And then it starts out with a regular movie. Like, that was one tracking shot around kind of this, you know, perpendicular square. I mean, equation. Like, it's like, woo, you know, and it sweeps down. And then finally, by the time it gets back to the car with the bomb in it, the car blows. And so then you have Charlton Heston's character exploring why he needs to go back to Mexico and fix this problem because something went wrong. And now he's got to go and, like, you know, he's got to send his wife to a hotel so he can go investigate. Something seems crooked about this cop that Orson Welles is playing. And Orson Welles was commenting on how he always put on weight for the role, like that he was putting on weight, like he was deforming his face, and like he was getting all, but just for the character, he was getting into it. And he really seems to live the part. Like, he doesn't look like himself in Citizen Kane. I mean, he doesn't look like the same person he plays in The Stranger. Like, he's very different film to film. Chimes at Midnight, again, it's a very different look for him. It's almost like these looks are malleable to almost any other look you can go for. Like with him or anything else. Like, now he's a henchman in Touch of Evil. You know, before he's like a debonair in Citizen Kane in half of it, and then kind of like a crooked businessman in the last half, you know. In The Stranger, he's like just a businessman that becomes like a hero, so he's like an everyday man. And not all of his films, even though he acted in films to pay for his films, not all of his films did he play in. He wasn't always the lead actor in his films, but a lot of times when he was, he could control the medium to the style that he preferred in the performance. And the performance would kind of lead the way to how he could edit together the movie, with his character kind of being the thing that stuck it all together with the shot to shot. There's always something familiar in the shots if you're your own character. You know, because then you can, when you're going back and editing, you could be like, well, we need this scene where I'm moving here, and that pretty much takes care of where the movie's going because the director just went by. Or no, the director just went by, so you know that's part of the movie. You know, it's like, oh, okay, I can see that. And it's not to make it easier, it's just to like index the film, like, oh, this is the part where I walk by in a raincoat, okay. And like, you know, it's interesting because when Alfred Hitchcock would do his cameos in his films as like a 3 seconds in it, that's not what that was for. I mean, it was a marker that like, yeah, we've got the film, but like it wasn't one of those displays of like, this is where we're going with the film and you've got to watch. That's a really And that Orson Welles kind of invented that. He did, except Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton were already doing independent films. And we talked about the different types of actors that would do independent films, and we see that like even Oscar Micheaux was doing independent films. There were these guys in the silent era that were doing avant-garde all the way through, and that's really where the independent movement came. The sound era was from avant-garde, and then like the Orson Welles came from that, and by the time it was 1941, then you're really talking that RKO could supply a independent film for Orson Welles and Citizen Kane. But the last, really quick, the one thing left, I'll say, to Journey into Fear, although it's kind of a quick through action, one plot point, and like The Stranger, it's really interesting to narrow on things like a book that would go to him later, or things like inventory throughout. The inventory, or the items that are objective correlatives, or items that are objective to the character, or to at least the plot, are always seen as like something you've got to like pick up and walk away with, like a book or something, or a pen. And it's like in The Stranger, there's like this tie or something. It's like there's always something that links you to the whole plot and to the next conflict, but the conflict comes from, should I read this journal that I see sitting here that my boss just told me to read, And it seems like those points of objective in the film noir are usually these darkened attempts to say, look, there's recorded information about the character in this film that he is going to supply his Nazi train with some great wealth that he's going to steal from you. You got to stop him. I see this little note, and then after that, the whole thing is like this pot boiler, like how action packed can I get to go until I finally have the final shootout with this guy. And so I can't really explain all the other movies that have to do with Journey into Fear. I know there's this whole study of it. I remember reading this book on Orson Welles, and it was talking about Citizen Kane, and before he made it, he was talking about Journey into Fear, and he was talking about how he was going to have a POV shot, and how it was a single POV, and it was one point of view from the guys, from the perspective of the lead character. It was Orson Welles, and you follow him along, and if you even see his face, like for the rest of the movie, you see the POV, or like in that movie, like Dark Passage, where they have the point of view shot, and it's going forward, and they see it from the point of view of the eyes of the person walking. So it'd be like a video game almost, or it goes straight out like this and like turns around, and it's from the point of view. So the point of that is like he was going to do the whole film like that, and he was told that wouldn't work. So then he came up with this eye camera, eye heart camera, something. It's like he wanted to do this thing where the camera was always watching what was going on, and never did he get that film done. That by the time of Touch of Evil, when he had all those shots in the dark, and everyone was like walking along in this pitch black darkness, then they had to edit so many of the shots that were offensive. Like if a gun were to come out in the light, then it would be like seeing an object that's offensive, because someone's going to get shot in the dark, and that, like in Touch of Evil, quite a few get shot in the dark and knocked down and thrown around, and there's poison in the glass when he's at the dance, and that Charlton Heston, his character, really wants to get back to the border or to America almost the minute he gets down there, because he realizes it's disgusting and stenchy or whatever, and he doesn't really want to go to this like cultural bang again. And then he forgot or something. He must have got hit on the head a couple of times because he forgot which way he was going. And now suddenly he's got his wife in a hotel, and she's got this strange hotel clerk, and it's Anthony Perkins and this is a year before Psycho. And so, and then you wonder, if they were filming both movies at once, how did they both get in both movies, Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins? And it's like, if they were both in Touch of Evil a year before and they were in Psycho, maybe they were shooting them at the same time and went back and forward to the sets. But like the one thing that was weird was like that Anthony Perkins was not like his Psycho self, and was actually more of like a silly guy. Like he's gone. Like he's like he must have got too drunk or hit on the head. That's the solution with the plot here. Too drunk or hit on the head, and so now he's like this eccentric curator. But if he turns on the lights or turns them off, then that signals whether he needs to press the blankets or come in the room, you know. And I think it's weird because when she turns on and off the lights, she's kind of like dancing around and she's saying, well, like, she's saying this is like a strobe light, you know. And then she goes in and then she's like, oh, that's how I lured him. Okay. And like, it's kind of like this strange like flirtation between the wife of Charlton Heston while he goes to go fight this untouchable, like scary, like larger than life Orson Welles character who's like eating like a ham sandwich in every shot. No, I mean, I don't know. It's not like he's like this big, sweaty, like he gets really mad and gets sweaty. But the clerk with Anthony Perkins is now kind of hitting on her, but not really because he's interested in her, but he knows she has a husband. And her husband knows his wife is good to him. And so we've got that all worked out. But it's really interesting because nothing really happens between it. But like it gets scary in there, like whether it's going to, you don't know if it's going to, like if someone's going to force the hand. You're really scared that she's trapped again. And Janet Leigh is in these movies like The Manchurian Candidate years later after Psycho, where she again finds herself like claustrophobic and then she gets trapped and then she's like has no way out, and it's like she's in this little box and she's not really thinking about it and she's just letting time go by, and then something can happen that's either devastating or even in Manchurian Candidate, I mean, there's all this hypnosis and people sent off with guns, and it's like this really, it's like a touch of evil mixed with Psycho, and then they've finally made the third one, you know? It's like, well, Touch of Evil, though, with all of its dark camera work, I mean, you look at that scene with Anthony Perkins, and the dark shadows come across his face and kind of overlap with his face, and his like mental, everybody in this film's mental credibility is in the shot. Like you can see how a person feels by looking behind them in Touch of Evil. Like you can see how each of them are reacting to the society, reacting to the Mexican demise of what happened to them compared to certain cities that are rich and flourishing and certain cities that have become sort of this smashed down, destroyed universe. And that, like, it's weird that the Americans are the ones that are basically, that you see in this movie for the most part, that have moved to Mexico or moved to the border because of whatever circumstance, and then Janet Leigh comes there with Charlton Heston. So there's like the main characters are mostly all American, but there's also some Mexican characters in there, and that's because it's a border town. And really, that doesn't mean it would be only Mexicans anyway. Like, it would probably be a mixed crowd of, like, even Americans and, like, other types of people that would move to Mexico and from America, and they're not always in the race, class, and gender of white, you know. They're not always, like, a white rich guy. And, like, that's what Charlton Heston kind of seems like in the movie, but he's playing a Mexican, but you're like, he's kind of that white rich guy. And it's kind of hide who he is as a actor. Like, that way you won't really pay attention to this big star, or you will, but it's like to bring down his usual, like, raging ego. And I think that's kind of a bad way to do it, but he brings it down to, like, this good ego tethered to, like, this, I'm gonna beat this as a cop. I'm gonna take this beat and go this detective route and take it. But he gets really allergies right when he gets to Mexico, and he's already not really interested in going on because it's like something that seemed good at the time looks really intimidating and hard to press on when it comes to Orson Welles' character, who is foreboding all over the frame. Orson Welles' character comes in to, speaking of showing your background in your mind, he comes in to see a fortune teller. It's Marlene Dietrich. He asks if Marlene Dietrich can tell him the future, and she's like, you have no future. You know, she's like telling him that his whole future is exposed, and like it's going to be this terrible thing where he reveals himself to all as the evil man he is. And this is all foreshadowing to the movie, and you're like, Well, she doesn't have much nice to say. She's like, you will never find love in the exercise of your harmony. You will live out your days in New York and try to see the better ways of a man. And I'm like, part of that didn't sound so bad, but for him, I don't know if he wants to leave Mexico. That's, he's like, so are you ever going to be back on the Drim side? And she's like, well, only if you touch me if I'm evil. That was the original line in that film. And then I think that was taken to another scene, and then there was some other pragmatic statement she made in lieu of that. But the point is that the film goes along this narrative that goes kind of like, it's still kind of following that one tracking shot from the beginning that had the 8 minutes. It's kind of still taking it from the second half and going on, and it's like this tracking shot hasn't ended. And it's like, by the time they're chasing each other, he's got the tape recorder and he's up here saying all these diabolical things, and the tape recorder's following him. It's that same kind of like left to right, like we're going to keep it going in this long burning, like make it look like one tracking shot. And that kind of has to do with the eye in the shot that's the point of view that follows the film everywhere. This is the side tracking view of a vehicle, like on tracks or on a vehicle on the road, and is following it on this sort of parallel that keeps going on and on. So now we look at the fact that, well, what do we see about the darkness enveloping this movie? And I think one of the things we forget is that he's trying to show that no light escapes the dark in Mexico. Like, it has something to do with a song that's like a Roy Rogers song, or No Light Will Ever Tread Again on My Lover in Mexico. I can't remember the name, but they're playing it maybe in the beginning sequence, like out of a tape player or out of a radio. And it's like, there's these kids that follow them over to like this parking lot, and before it blows up in the opening tracking shot, and you're like watching them like as they're on this pavemented city, and everything's pavemented here has to do with the colonization almost of these like places that are between Mexico and America, that are like both Mexican and American, but that have sort of this like middle class feeling to them, that like these guys came from the north to find something that they could do to live on, and they kind of ended up in these cities. And these cities aren't really depressing. Some of them can be fun, or like a regular small town or whatever, but like some of them can be really like isolationist and really like, no, there's no way to get any source of like entertainment or any source of like culture would really be difficult, because the route to where they're at in Mexico isn't even an easy route to follow. And there's kind of this like zoned area that like they've got to go stop the corrupt American police guy from killing everybody and then killing himself or whatever. It looks like it's going to be a really bad fall apart like wreck at the end. And it is the whole movie he's wrecking. It's like he wrecks when he has to go to the hotel, like the car wrecks at the beginning and explodes. And so Touch of Evil is following in these black night, but it's supposed to be kind of like looking like natural lighting too, like that the whole area would have been consumed by darkness if it was even that time of day or that time of night. And so that moving side to side and editing side to side is still the shot like constantly moving, but it's actually moving this way and not this way. Like when it moves this way, it's a whole new picture. But when it moves this way, it's like the picture's the same and you're just dropping it down on top of it or bringing it down from up here in the projector, where it's like 24 frames. And then that's 1 second, and it kind of passes by that way. But it passes by this way and this way is really important to remember for us when we're watching film and film stock. Even digital does the same kind of thing, because they motivate the frame of the photograph into the same kind of spot as film to recreate it. And so now we're back to the main point of this whole discussion. Touch of Evil edits out certain scenes. They edit out certain scenes because they're too far. They went too far with censorship, or Orson Welles thought it was too long, or the studio thought it was too long and convinced him it was, even when he wasn't convinced. But they were taking out like some violent scenes. I think especially the ones that had happened to Janet Leigh. And part of that reason was because they probably knew she was coming up in Psycho with some really violent scenes. So she didn't want to. They didn't want to have too many scenes that looked the same as Psycho. Although it doesn't really look the same as Psycho, but I think Touch of Evil actually has the darker camera shooting, because like it's all at night during Touch of Evil, and sometimes parts of Psycho are during the day, and it's always this like got this Dawn of the Dead kind of feel in Psycho, and you're like looking out and everybody's hazy because they're hungover, and everybody's hungover in Touch of Evil too. Like there's this dance party that before the car breaks down, the wife and her husband are at this like small town like dance party, and that they drink and drink and drink, and that they keep corking them down, and that they've drank like all this alcohol, and that's the reason they have trouble with the car, and that's the reason she has to stay at the hotel, is because she doesn't want to go on his like adventure mission with him, and she didn't really say she was going to, but she said, hey, I might go with you tomorrow. And so he's like still thinking, well, are you going to go with me tomorrow? And it's like, why would he take his wife along with him in the first place? Like that's like one of the jokes of the film, because it's like he must have taken her because like she couldn't do anything else, and he was like, well, you probably have to stay at a hotel the whole time. And then like meanwhile, while this was all going on, Orson Welles' character is like a detective, and so he's got scenes cut out too with Marlene Dietrich. He's got scenes cut out where he's shooting some guy, and it shows more of it, shows the guy get blown away or something. I mean, there's all these scenes that get edged out. It was almost like when Natural Born Killers was being edited, and they took out like every fifth scene, and like that's what they were doing in Touch of Evil. Just like there's so much messed up in this, we're just going to take it out as we go, and they basically, like Magnificent Ambersons, Touch of Evil got buried to its half form at an hour or something, and like was this, everything was raunched out of it and destroyed, and they were doing that at the censorship office when the censorship was getting like closer and closer to Red Scare. They're getting like this Nazi scare on Journey into Fear, and then later they're at Touch of Evil, and they see this long take at the beginning, and they're already like, well, we can leave that in if we take out like a sixth of every other scene, because it's like they have to have like morally compensating values even when they're editing. They're like, well, I didn't take out this scene, so I've got to ruin your other one. It's like, I don't know why they have to do that. Like, it's censorship almost on Orson Welles, even for just having too good of a film. I mean, his film is too good, so like they're watching it in the editing booth, and they're like, no, this is going to compete with too many people. You can't have her getting stabbed. It's like, okay, so Orson Welles, it falls on him to do something no one else has done, even though he's doing it first. So he's doing it first, and now it's something that's never been done because it was first. And then you're like, well, from now on, we're going to follow him around and mess up all his films. I mean, that's what he was saying in Magnificent Ambersons. He was like saying, when I started editing that film, I realized there were big parts of it taken out that I didn't know what happened to them, and they were pretty much thrown away and destroyed. They were thrown away and destroyed. Like the whole pile of films were thrown away, and then like after that, everything that was in my films started being like dragged out and relifted. And then you've got to think, for the home entertainment version of like the Turner Classic Movie version and all that, they try to have the best version. So then UCLA and the Library of Congress, they put together all of these like images of Touch of Evil that were left and tried to salvage what they can, recreating some of the backgrounds in the black, dark shots of the car and everything else moving through this sort of like seamless world of dark, but it's not as seamless with scenes missing, and you can kind of tell where scenes are cut out, and that kind of makes half the fun to Touch of Evil, to say like, whoa, if you see a big jump right there, they cut a scene out, and that was probably a scene that they were gonna cut out anyway, but like edit out is the real way to say it. Editing out those scenes was scary, but like when Orson Welles got back to Touch of Evil, it was like Magnificent Ambersons. Half of it was gone. Most of it was decked away into the too dark of footage section. Some of it was decked away into the too violent, too sexy. Some of it was language you can't use, and you can still see them word syncing it to their lips. And then the audio got like this, like for an audio film to experiment on audio, like when it first got recorded, almost all of it got trashed and thrown away. None of this was Orson Welles' fault. And he's a resilient one. Like, he'll come back through the film and he'll be like, all right, we got to do half of it over. Let's go. He's like, this is the last day of shoot. Let's get the second half made. He's very determined to get the films made. It was things like Citizen Kane that he's making moments of it happened at the last minute that were so important for the film, but he hadn't filmed it yet, but he knew he was going to, and now he's got 24 hours to film, and he's got to capture all those shots, and he gets like half of them, and they go back in, and it like saves the movie from like destruction. And in an Orson Welles film, you got to realize you're experimenting anyway. It's avant-garde anyway. Like you're taking these like concepts of film style and film form, and you're building on them in these like cinematic interest. Like the cinematic interest of a widescreen film in Touch of Evil is so 1950s that it gauges that like 2.85, 3.33 to 1 ratio, where it's like this perfect widescreen all the way across, and at UCLA and the Library of Congress archive restored it based on its widescreen appeal. And the widescreen appeal also makes sense because it's like that rectangle that is going one direction and absorbing everything, but not by the time it gets to the Dark Knight and Orson Welles' big fat sheriff that's supposedly angry at everybody, and it shows him slothing around, and finally, and like Orson Welles wanted to make him a real bad guy in the movie, and finally he decides to kill the Charlton Heston character and goes after him. Like he was trying to blow him up anyway, he was trying to kill him anyway, and like now at the end, the Charlton Heston character is like, well, I'm going to take this recorder. He's talking to the detectives at the border, and they're like, well, he's going to kill you when he gets here, and you're going to get, your leg blown off, and you're going to get your head blown off. And they're saying all this stuff, and I'm actually surprised it wasn't edited out because it was pretty hardcore. And the guys are saying he's going to get all shot up, and he's like, well, maybe I can get him. And he's like cocking his gun, maybe I can get him. I don't know. We'll see. What do you think? I go get him now, and I record what he's saying. And he like puts on this tape recorder, and he walks out, and he's kind of, the shot's like hazy. It's kind of like, whoa. And it's not quite day. It's not quite night. It's like this weird fog rolled in. And then he walks on this sort of like perpendicular shot again, parallel, like everything's to the deep focus long take. It's like the background is focused out up to here, and you see the shots of him walking along and microphoning while recording the notorious Orson Welles statements. And I don't have that speech memorized. It's like, we who do not pardon the change in all things common sense have therefore been at use in our pleasure, for now is we not to be. And like that's how that conversation starts. So you notice there's like this like almost like parallel with the like British, English, UK theater, where it's like he's like kind of purposely doing this Mercury theater thing as a joke, like this statement, this like broadcast, as though he's broadcasting it to everyone. And that's the irony, is then when you watch it as a movie, everyone gets the broadcast, and it's like, we're like, okay, so is he doing a play? Is he throwing back to Othello, which we talked about last time? I don't even think there's any chance that this movie really came out right after Lady from Shanghai, because Lady from Shanghai is very close in time to when this movie came out, but that he could have been making 5 movies in between each time that never saw the light, or were personal films that he made that only went to one person, and like it was just like a personal film he made, and that was for someone else, and it wasn't really for public screening. That was another kind of thing. He would make movies not for public screening, but for like simple screening. I mean, he talks about that in Citizen Kane when he's got that dance party there. It's like his own private use, this party, not like a personal use for everybody. And that's like, well, thank you very much. I'm glad, because in the cop in Touch of Evil that he plays, that's evil, he doesn't believe in personal property. Like he thinks all property is his. And so when he's getting shot down at the end because he's getting caught, and Charlton Heston takes a couple of shots too. They're shooting at each other from kind of this, like these 2 parallel beams that are above each other. And like they're walking on him, and he's got the recording. So he's like, now I've got the recording I needed. Thank you. And it's like, when he gets the whole recording, he knows he's got him lambasted. He knows he's got him framed up, because now he's like, well, you're the one that said all that. So do you want to say any comment? And it's like, solid silence. It's like Orson Welles is now this like terrible, scary figure, taken down and shown his own humility. And it's like he's trying to play that part of it, and he's kind of walking away like he can't say anything. And is it like he's he knows that in the film that he did a great job directing, probably by how miserable and despondent his own character looks in the film, being sort of walked back into the black background that's behind him. And when Orson Welles gives the sign that this is like an avant-garde experimental film, well, that's one thing the censors of Magnificent Ambersons and Touch of Evil didn't really reckon for. That the metaphoric narrative that had linked together in the films was avant-garde and experimental. There's not really much you can do as an editor to change that or wreck that or try, because you could wreck it and that could be part of the experiment. What's the editor going to wreck? You know, I mean, you could do part of an experiment on a film and trick them all to edit it the way you wanted it to. That's kind of what Hitchcock and John Ford would do. They'd just be like, well, it's this splice, this splice, this splice, and this splice. And there was no other way to splice it than that. But in Orson Welles, it's like they're taking out all these fragments of things they don't like throughout, things that are like R-rated or something, and R-rating's not out yet. You know, it's still the production code, and it's condemned for some reason when they first release it. And Orson Welles does a great take it out of theaters again, added a few more parts out. It's these parts that don't make sense. I mean, those are all chunks missing from the movie, and now we're thinking this movie has those like edited out scenes which aren't on purpose. But man, do they make it more avant-garde? Because look at this. You know, it's like that's what it feels like in a David Lynch film too. You're like, this is just more avant-garde from like how the editor ruined it. Like it's like this film could be called "It's a Great Film," except the editor ruined it, and that's what makes it a great film is because we pointed that out. You know, it's like it's not a. Now, let me say one thing in defense of editors. Hollywood editors never ruin films. They're the best. It's hard to figure out how to do everything. Follow the eye, follow the movement, follow the casing of each second of the frame. You know, a real editor. But these editors that were censorship guys, I mean, they would just take a big chunk of film and take the whole thing out, even though back and front and during the middle there'd be things that they could have gotten out and made them simple. But they don't know that. They're just told to excise this frame this has to be excised, and they go through and chomp it off and reconnect it. I mean, the director doesn't even get to see it all the way up to the production code, mainly all the way up or till the production code fails, mainly in '66 with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, all because not just the timing and the form, but because the audience is not allowed to see sex and violence, at least the way we saw it in the 90s, you know, back in the 50s, no. They're not allowed to see sex and violence unless it's like sort of referred to or metaphorical of or a double entendre. Even that can be tricky propaganda. But one thing I'll tell you about censorship is as it goes on, each film throughout fights another battle that gets it on a further stage of what it can and can't show. Like by the time it's Touch of Evil, like they're battling everything again with Touch of Evil. Like they just got done with with Anatomy of a Murder and some other things. And like now they're coming up with Touch of Evil and all these other films are coming out that they have to like let some of it fly. The really dirty stuff's pretty much been shown and taken out so that the censor knows that they've been self-censoring, you know. And that's always a trick because you like put the scene in that you know you want to take out just to scare the censor into thinking nothing needs taken out because we already took out the worst part, you know. And then you have this bad editor guy that's not even an editor. You just have him cutting out frame to frame of the scene that was considered too sexy or too violent or too funny about lewd material, and you just have to hawk it out. Now, when they're restoring film, I'm sure at UCLA, Library of Congress, they had found the different parts of Touch of Evil, and they were like, well, we can assimilate them back into almost the movie, but it's still 40 minutes off. And like that 40 minutes off is like, because it's like 20 minutes is a reel, you know, and 40 minutes is like 2 reels. And because 2 reels didn't go back on, that means they did actually restore like 40 minutes. So it was an hour and 20, or 2 hours and 20 minutes originally with Orson Welles' time, and then it's an hour and 40 minutes, or it's an hour when they get the edited version that hits theaters in America, and then finally they restore it. Recently again, they restored it in the 90s and 2Ks, and they got it back to an hour and 40. And the hour and 40 movie is a lot more understandable. It's a lot more to gain from. It's a lot more of like a wow, so they are really tracking through this dark pungent black of like this barely seeable like film noir world that finally Orson Welles, even though he's got all his scenes cut out anyway, and even though he's got shot in 2 missing scenes, and even though the missing scenes reveal what he does to escape and then reveal him getting caught again, and even though the missing scenes kind of reveal them going to deeper into Mexico, Charlton Heston and Janet Leigh are back together from the hotel. Anthony Perkins did not touch her or anything, and we're all relieved by that. What a suspense. And then they drive off into Mexico, and most of that's all obliterated and taken out, but you can still totally see that's what they're trying to do. And then like that is taken away, and sort of this walk that he's walking behind is so Chinatown, because everybody's got their backs turned, and then it just ends. I mean, it's so perfect, dude, that the editor chunked out a bunch of stuff, and it's still a great movie. I mean, you can't even believe that you can't even cut those films to pieces by Orson Welles and ruin them. They still look great. And some of the thought was that maybe on some of the films they were editing, they were taking funding from some enemies, not just from studios, but like enemies in general that didn't like that he was an independent director, didn't really like who he was as a person, and just wanted to edit his films all to pieces and taking them piecemeal. And that Orson Welles had like a version that was like an hour and a half, that he had tangled back together from every picture. But fortunately, with the notes of his Touch of Evil re-editing plan, they showed that it could be 12 footage could be added to it, 12 minutes of footage, a half a reel. And that has something to do with how they keep their reels, so the reels don't break and the reels get heavy. Someday they'll have another way of archiving these films, and they'll have a way to like instantly archive a film like Touch of Evil, and that someday you'll be able to maybe even restore those scenes that are missing if a vault somewhere has them, an archive somewhere has those extra shots. I do know the film video copy at California Institute for the Arts is a really good version of Touch of Evil. They have the Laserdisc version, and I'm not supposed to say that word out loud, but it's a really good one, and USC has it. And you have to be a film major at those schools, or like be major, or like a grad student or film history major, and you kind or class that you have to be taking to get to see the version in the cinema library. But I've seen some other versions of it. That was my favorite one. It had this whole scene in it that was part of the carnival scene, which goes right into the end where he's chasing him. And the carnival scene was like a throwback or kind of side view to Third Man. It was like the Touch of Evil and Third Man were kind of going and forth and being out at the same time. And they kind of work. Third Man was this movie that Orson Welles is in, Joseph Cotton's in. They're all doing this whole thing where they're in Vienna, and Orson Welles is this evil dude with all this bad penicillin that he is selling, and so Joseph Cotton has to stop him, and there's all these like film noir darkened scenes that take these big long tracking shots, deep focus, long take, that are like these parallel exams. There's more to the baroqueness of Third Man, and that like there's more to it in the carnival, like in the carnival of Touch of Evil, which is just kind of tableau and sitting there in lights, and the carnival where Orson Welles almost throws Joseph Cotton out of the ride when it's really high up in the air, and he's yelling at him and everything. And then later there's this big shootout in the sewers underneath, and it's Carol Reed, and it's like, well, if this is how Orson Welles makes films, I'm going to make films like this, said Carol Reed when he had Orson Welles in the movie. And that he's making Touch of Evil at the same time, and it's got a few of the castmates in it, and it's got Orson Welles looking completely day and night different than he does in Third Man. So I wondered if you had to go makeup, back and forth, But the point is that like by the end of the total shocking film noir burial, you can tell the British UK English version of Third Man has hardly any censorship and has the whole version intact, whereas the independent film by Welles, the Touch of Evil, everyone loves that film too, but you can tell that there's scenes just lifted and thrown out. It seems like one of the worst case scenarios, like Greed and Magnificent Ambersons, which was also Welles, Eric von Stroheim's Greed. It seemed like one of the worst examples where anyone had gotten a bad idea to edit out a scene that was important for the movie, and especially such a well-made movie, like being that Third Man so generous in its shots, and being that the shots of Touch of Evil are personally like this broken down world, this kind of like flattened, broken down world that's kind of like isolationist. And either way you look at it, whatever they did, it still sucks that they took it out. But it kind of makes it innovative that there are ways to salvage a film like that. And they could salvage a film like that is like really cool, because then you can go all the way to the future with it and say this was what it originally looked like. But salvaging that film alone, you can read books about it, and it wasn't easy, and it was hard to get all the timing, and it was hard to see what all was thrown out versus what was keep in. But ultimately, the true touch of evil was that they could have just shown that student film at the beginning where they follow the car with the time bomb and it blows up. And that would have already showed us that Orson Welles was probably got a vault somewhere of all these films that he once started and that all he was shooting, and for whatever reason they never finished because of the complications in the movie that they didn't finish. So that there's half scenes, forward scenes, backward scenes. Touch of Evil's got it all with the editing: forward, backward, up, front, down, and right, deep focus, long take, and a few montages. So that he looks like he's got the grammar of film as it's broken down and isolated, and the broken down and isolated comes off with the edgy sort of pops in the film that, like, a whole scene just got jacked out. But Orson Welles made the best of it, and by making the best of it, he made some of the best of the films. So we'll talk next week more about Orson Welles. I think we're talking about the trial next time. So come early, and we'll get you ready for the ultimate in existentialism at Orson Welles Films.